Hi everyone, my name is Carson Weitnauer and I serve as the Executive Director for Uncommon Pursuit. And today our featured guest is Bob Smietana. He is the National Religion Reporter for Religion News Service. He's the author of this new book that I read, Reorganized Religion. There's his name, want to highlight that for Bob. Excellent book and want to recommend it to you. To get us into today's conversation, I want to share with you a thought, and that is this. Sometimes a truth becomes cliche because we've heard it way too many times, and sometimes a truth gets avoided because we just can't stand it. And that idea is that the world is changing. You've heard that so many times, it's boring. Of course the world is changing. But there are other days when you and I, we want to get back in bed, pull the covers over our head because we cannot stand how rapidly and disorientingly the world is changing all around us. And so we need a caring guide, someone who is out there listening and learning and curious, who is observing the changes taking place in our world and can help us make sense of that. And I think you're going to find that Bob is going to help us do that today. Religion is a critical part of our country, of our world, and the way in which people are religious shapes all of our lives. Whatever faith tradition you're in, whether you adhere to a particular tradition or you don't, or you're cobbling together ideas from different ones, what people do with religion matters, and it's affecting our world. And so today you can expect a deep dive. You can, I hope, expect respect and compassion and curiosity. And if some of what you hear today is disturbing or uncomfortable, at least you can process it at home from the comfort of your computer or your phone and just take some time to take in all that is changing. So Bob, welcome to the Uncommon Pursuit community. Thank you for coming to serve us today. I want to jump right in and talk about the craft of journalism with you for a second. You have talked in other places about objective empathy and curiosity and listening to people's stories and telling them carefully and respectfully. And I wanted to just hear from your heart, what led you to want to tell so many stories in Reorganized Religion? And what's on the top of your heart and your mind as you listen to people and empathize with them and try and tell their stories for other people?
So a couple things. I mean, for the book, I had been observing all these changes on the religious landscape and trying to make sense of them myself. And I actually had a talk with a friend recently. Their church was about to close, and they felt guilty, as if it was their fault. They were just a regular church member, but they thought, we should have done something differently. And what I wanted to say to them, this is not your fault. It's a problem you have to deal with, right? The decline of religion, the change of religion. But it's not like you did something wrong and that's why the people didn't come. Or that's why your church had problems. One of the things I tell people is that I have the best job in the world because I get to talk to people about religion, about the meaning of life and the most important things to them, and I'm not trying to win. And that I think is a real gift to people, because most time when we talk about things that matter to us, we want to be heard. We want to say that we're right about these things, and when someone's listening to them, what happens is they are trying to counter them. They're always thinking about, how do I counter this? How do I do judo on this argument, rather than just listening to what they had to say and understanding it. So if you ask a question, it's to prove why they're wrong, not to understand what they're trying to say. And that can be a real gift to people because it treats them as they're important. It takes their ideas important, and it just treats them as someone worthy of respect. So I like to hear what other people think because I already know what I think, and why would I want to know more about what I think? I'd rather know what you think. And if I ask you questions, and then I might ask questions and say, well, I don't understand how that works. That's a different question than saying you're wrong, you're dumb. Now, of course, I do that sometimes with my friends, and sometimes I don't always do perfect. And sometimes there are hard questions, right? You have to ask difficult questions, but you are really approaching people to say, like, you're important enough for me to pay attention to, and I want to make sure when I reflect what you have said and what you think that I'm doing it accurately.
So just as we try and listen to you and what you found, just bring us in a little bit to the challenge of listening well. what do you find helps you listen well to people's stories? And what do you find to be some of the barriers to really hearing where someone is coming from?
That's a great question. I think, technology can be a help in that you throw a recorder on and then it runs and you can pay attention to them. It can be a hindrance and that the recorder's on so you're not paying attention to them. You're outsourcing your hearing to the person. Note-taking can be like that because I'm writing things down. I'm trying to keep up and make sure I get it correctly. I think the challenge is, too, people say things, she's like, what are they talking about? But I think one of the big challenges is that we're just all so distracted. And because you're distracted, it's hard to pay attention and to really hear what people say. I've been working hard on that, but that's been harder, especially with Zoom and COVID, because you're doing it over Zoom like this, which can be great for conversation one-on-one, but also you can have like, oh, wait, wonder what's going on Twitter. I wonder what my email is saying. Wonder whatever, your mind kind of flits around. So I think the challenge is to really keep focused. That's why I really prefer to report face-to-face, because you listen better, even if you got a recorder going on. And I miss tape recorders. I miss cassette tapes because it was going round and round. And you're like, okay, I know this is working. The little red light's on. And if it gets stuck, I can fix that, right? If the tape gets stuck, you can you can take it out. You can rewind the tape. It's going to be okay. If a file gets corrupted, it's gone. I had an interview recently where the person was saying it was about Christian nationalism, and the person had about 25 conspiracy theories all molded into one. That I was like, okay, I'm writing this down. The recorder, I think my recorder just was like, I can't handle this anymore. It turned off. So I have most of it because I heard him. We were face to face. If we had done it over the phone, it'd have been awful because I would have lost it all.
Wow. So I think that's something we can all relate to, is the prevalence of technology and the way in which that distracts us, whether it's something we actually look at and pay attention to, or we're thinking about what is happening, this, FOMO. I hope I'm not missing out on an important conversation elsewhere. And just the ability to be present to someone, to give them our full attention and care about who they are and what they're saying and be alive to that moment. Mm-hmm. That's a discipline we all have to work on today if we're really going to understand each other and make that connection. And it sounds like the other thing to pick up from earlier is, are we listening to come back with our point, or are we listening to understand? Do we feel that there's some kind of urgency of, okay, I've heard you, now I can come back with my perspective? Or do we feel that there's this abundance of spaciousness and trust where I can just hear you and take the time to process that? And that's in itself a good thing to give to another person.
Yeah. This is a kind of, this is related, but after, one downside of having, like, if you go to church and you have a Bible on your phone, the downside is you have all the other parts of it. So my daughter, for a while, used to take my phone away when we went to church because I was tweeting out part of the sermon. But the pastor would say something, I would be fact-checking. Not like the theology, but like they would tell some anecdote, and I'm like, I don't know about that. So then I would be the pastor would be, sharing this preaching, and I would be off checking the details of their sermon notes to see if they were actually accurate. So there's a bias towards inattention in the technology.
That's helpful. And I also think that points to a thread of your research, and that is the way in which pastors have changed their place in our society from a trusted authority and knowledge expert whose words are taken seriously and given the benefit of the doubt, to an environment where many pastors, during the sermon at church, there's some level of suspicion. Is that exactly how it went down? I need to verify the sermon as it's taking place. And it's not just you. I've done that. I think pastors have probably done that listening to someone else preach. Yeah. In Reorganized Religion, you share an analogy from Dr. Josh Packard. He's with Springtide Research. And he says that churches need to realize they are no longer the star of the show, where everyone is paying attention to what's happening in their community. But rather, they're like one tree, in the forest, and they're a part of the ecosystem. They're still a standing tree, but a lot of other things are taking place all around the broader environment. And so, based on your research and your interviews and your time with faith leaders, what do you think is going to make it difficult for pastors to transition from seeing themselves as the star of the show to being one part of the broader ecosystem?
Well, one thing that makes it difficult is that they've been trained to see things theologically and spiritually. So if things are going well in their church, they think, oh, I must have the right theology, or I have God's favor. And they downplay kind of the environmental impacts on them. The same thing happens with if things go wrong. Oh, I've done the wrong thing spiritually. What has my theology gone wrong? What have I done wrong? It's a really center to think that they are like the star of the play, and every decision that they make impacts everyone else, instead of seeing what is the impact of the world around them. So it's hard to get out of that view. Like if you were a tree, it's hard to see the forest. It's hard to take that look back and go, oh, what's happening here? Why is the environment changed? What are the patterns around me that are making it so that people aren't showing up, or that we have conflict, or whatever it is? I think they're also used to being listened to, so it's harder. And I think this goes alongside with another change in church infrastructure. There's a move really towards a staff-driven model, especially at larger churches, but even smaller churches. So the move away from congregational governance, which has its problems, right? We've all been in church meetings last forever and never get anywhere. But there is a move towards just having a few staff people get everything done, and puts a lot of pressure on them to be the decision makers. And they've lost this ability to persuade and communicate. And that is a problem for church leaders. And the problems they face are very complex right now. And they often have limits on what they can do to adapt to it. You know, in some ways they're like a tree that they can't pick up and move, right? They can't move, and they might have institutional limits, which are well-intentioned, but were not meant for such a rapidly changing world.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that kind of theology that says if you are faithful to God, then you can expect, kind of the same thing that happened in Acts will happen to you. If you follow the way they did it in the Gospels and in Acts, you're also going to see the same kind of church growth in your life today.
Yeah.
And part of that, I think, also comes from the books. So there are all kinds of books and conferences that say, hey, I'm a successful pastor. Our church has been named one of the 10 fastest growing churches in the entire universe. And here's the 8 things we did that led to that outcome. Yep. And so if you learn these 8 steps and implement them with excellence, you can get there too. And I'm not saying that those don't work sometimes, but they can kind of oversell what's possible for someone else. And it also seems to me, from my own convictional place, that the scriptures offer plenty of stories of faithfulness to God that didn't result in a big church. I mean, I think of Isaiah or Jeremiah. Their prophecies are in the Bible. God confirms, these are my messengers. But it doesn't seem like they had a very successful career. They didn't build a large movement. It wasn't a revival in Israel because of their message. And even Jesus, he did a pretty good job, I'd say a perfect job, of representing God as God. And his life ends in crucifixion, and even his closest disciples abandoning him. And so we may need to rethink that if-then statement. If I'm faithful to God, then everyone will flock to our church.
Yeah, we see it in a really couple ways. You see it, I think, you're right, in the kind of books and the methodology-driven count that you think, if I do this method, then we're going to attract people. I remember years and years ago, whenever the Purpose-Driven Church came out, Rick Warren's first book, or one of his early books, and the minute I was on a church council back then, and the pastor bought him, we're going to read this, it's going to be great. And I read the first chapter about, I picked the fastest growing suburb in California and moved there. Now, Rick Warren did all kinds of other things to flourish in that environment, but the context mattered. So sometimes the context doesn't get thought. Everything becomes theological or methodological. I decide this, then I'm going to work it out this way. It goes back to that kind of idea that we are really driving the bus here. We're in charge of making this happen. And you are. I mean, that's what a pastor has to do. You have to gather people. You have to make something happening. But there's a bias against looking at context in that.
That's helpful. Now, I don't want to pick on pastors. I love good pastors and think they're under a lot of unfair criticism. The good, caring ones that are true shepherds and servants of the people in their churches. And so I don't want to pick on them too much. I also want to ask about the expectations of people within congregations, people who are going to church on a regular basis. And how are you hearing their stories from across the country, different traditions? What's going to make it harder for them to see their church family not as the star of the show, but as one participant in their city or in their rural context? What makes it hard for people who are part of a church to adapt to what's happening in America?
Well, one of it is just that there's so much happening at the same time, and maybe we could talk about that in a little bit. But there's, and I think for pastors, this is a very difficult. There are no easy answers. Everything is changing all at the same time, and so you it's not one thing you can do, and you probably can't make anyone happy because everyone's unhappy, and all the external pressures of the culture are coming to play in your congregation. One thing I do think it's going to be difficult is the expectations of many congregations and churches were formed in a world where people went to church. And what you were really doing was competing for market share of the people to go to church. So you want to attract people, say, you're going to go to church anyway. This is why our church might be the right fit for you. Now you might say this is why our church is better as well. But often it was like, this is what our brand of church is. This is what is this a good fit for you? You should come here. And they were thinking that people came there wanted to fit that sort of brand or style or expression of Christianity, and they thought they would adapt to that because they came there. So now you have a world where people don't, and they shared a set of values, right? So now you have a world where people don't think going to church is for them. So if people come who aren't churchgoers, you have to first convince them that this might be of some interest to them. And you can't assume that they're going to know much about Christian doctrine or practice. You certainly can't assume that they are drawn to your particular brand of Christianity, right? Your stream or your expression. So if you go to any congregation, if you're a Baptist or Methodist church, you can't assume that the people in your congregation are Baptists and Methodists. They might be coming because they like that congregation. And people may not adapt to this. They may have new ideas. I think that one other thing is that, I think that adaptation is a problem because if you assume that people are going to come and have the same ideas about how to worship and how Christianity is practiced and have different ones, that's disruptive because you don't want to have that kind of sense that we're all in the same boat together.
That's a lot of different challenges to sort through, and I think each of those are something that people need to tease out and reflect on. How do I understand my congregation? It's nice to think we're all the same. We all believe the same thing. We all have the same values. We're all here for the same reason. But actually, the people I'm sitting next to in the pews may not agree with all of those things. And it's a challenge to maintain a coherent story and a unified community, given how divergent and different our experiences are and how we bring those into church on Sunday or at some other time. So, Bob, let's think about some of the mega trends. How is the forest changing? What was the forest like in 1950, and what is the forest like today in 2022? What are some of the mega shifts that have happened over, say, the past 50, 60, 70 years?
Well, I'll tell you a number of them. One, demographics is the biggest one, or one of the biggest ones. We're in the switch to what Pew Research calls the next America. And the way I've come to think about it is this, one way of thinking about it is this way. When I was born in 1965, the country was mostly white, mostly Christian, and most of the Christians were Protestant. and Christianity had a kind of privileged place. In fact, there was competition over which Christians would be in charge. There was a huge Catholic-Protestant divide over which Christians would be in charge. So my daughter is about to have a baby. So when my granddaughter's born in December, she'll be born into a country where half the babies are not white, where there's no, and going into a country where there's going to be no ethnic majority, and where a growing number of people are not religious. Right? So 1 out of 4 Americans right now is what we call a none, or no, they have no religious affiliation. That's among young people. That's about a third of people. So that's one big problem. It's a much more diverse. So if your congregation doesn't look more diverse than you are, you're not reaching that community. Your community is going to change. And your church was mostly built for that other world. Your church was probably built for a world which most people went to church, most of them are white, most of them are Protestant. And now they're not going to be. So how do you change that? Or how do you adapt to that? The second one is the big sort. So at the same time we're becoming more diverse, people have sorted themselves into what they call stacking identities, where they live next and work and worship and go to events with people who look like they do, who think like they do, who vote like they do. And the way you get things done in a society like that is you figure out how you can get people to hate the right people, right? So they call it affective polarization. It's not that you disagree. So in like the U.S., when you look at policy, people don't always disagree on policy. There's a lot of consensus on policy, but there is also consensus on who we don't like. So if you look at the issue of abortion, right, there are lots of folks who think that abortion should be legal and have limits. That's the kind of vast majority of Americans. You won't get that passed because the one group of people who, the Republicans and Democrats don't like each other in this case and don't want to work together. So you say, well, I don't care if we agree on policy, we can't work with them because they are the people we hate. And you can't motivate people in that kind of sordid society based on cooperation. There's just loss of faith in institutions that we talked about, right? People don't believe in institutions. They are kind of congregations of one and information sources of one. And this is government, schools, the church. People only trust themselves. There's this kind of broader decline of organized religion that's part of that. So less than half Americans for the first time belong to a church. This is the first time in the last, since the 1930s, when people started tracking this, 1 in 4 people is a nun. And then there's a kind of this rise of what I would call transactional religion, which is it's related to this polarization issue, that you are loved in your community as long as you agree with everyone and vote the same way and do the same things. And when you disagree, you are excommunicated. You lose that place because there's a kind of need for sameness. So those are kind of the big trends. There's a lot of other ones. Then we have the whole, the issue of sexuality, the issue which is we moved from a mostly heteronormative culture to a more LGBT affirming culture. We moved to less patriarchal to more egalitarian culture. All these things are happening at the same time. And we have economic and technological disruption. So if you look at all that things, it really is, everything is happening all at the same time. And so churches are trying to say, well, the world that, so you used to be able to build an institution in the U.S. that was mostly white and mostly Christian. And you could build the long-term sustainable institutions on that. And those institutions might serve everyone, but the core of it was mostly white, mostly Christian folks. That core is no longer existing. The mostly older Christians are getting older. They're dying off. They're having fewer kids, and our society has become more divided. So people are not to get together. So you cannot build your church on that old base. So I use this kind of the Jesus' parable about the building your house on the rock or your sand. Well, the assumptions that people built their churches and institutions on have changed, and all that sand has been washed away, and so now they're trying to figure out, well, what do we do? But it's complicated. It's very complicated. I don't think people understand that if their congregation is having problems. So one thing we see is that when I started covering religion in 1999, the average congregation was 137 people. Now that is 65 people. That's enormous change over a small period of time, right? 20 years. So people would think, well, that's somehow our fault. So if your church is 65 people and you lost half the people, you're just as normal as anybody else. But that's a lot of, you would think this is my fault if we only had. There was a long time this idea that if you had liberal religion, you shrunk. If you had conservative religion, you grew. Well, now the conservatives are shrinking too. Especially if you're mostly white, if you're Southern Baptist, you're shrinking. Southern Baptists lost in the last 15 years 2 million people. The Missouri Synod Lutherans, you don't get more conservative than them, right? Conservative theologically, very conservative liturgically, they're shrinking because they're not diverse, and so you can no longer say that our theology is going to save us the way people used to think of it. So it's kind of a big picture. It's a lot, everything happening all at the same time, and pastors are trying to adapt, and their heads are spinning, and their people feel uncertain, right? Because of all this, everyone is tense and everyone is uncertain, and that's one reason why this affective polarization works, because if you're tense and you're uncertain and you don't know what the future is, you need someone to blame and you need someone to give you an easy answer. And so if the answer is those people should blame and they caused the problem, that's simple and easy. It's much easier to think I can blame someone than I have to fix my situation or adapt to this changing environment. It's a long kind of speech, but it's really, I think that the kind of, I don't think people were built for the kind of changes they're seeing at the same time right now.
That's a lot of different changes to take in. And this may be the point where people are pulling the covers back over their heads and getting back into bed.
Yes, I don't like it when I go to my favorite restaurant and they don't have what I like, or they change the recipe. Massive social change. Who wants to deal with that?
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to process. So to take this another step in, and you've already gone to this, so there's a really good segue here. Mark Chavez at Duke calls one of the mega trends the Walmart effect. And in commerce, you can have a nice town, everyone's got their mom and pop businesses, it's great. Then Walmart comes in and just dominates with this huge store, tons of selection, prices are way lower, they've got groceries, one stop, you get everything you need, and mom and pop businesses just start going out of business. They can't compete with the pressure. And we would update this now, I think, to the Amazon effect.
Yeah.
And this is akin to the megachurch effect. A lot of mom and pop churches of 130 or so people 20 years ago, and then a megachurch comes in, and because there's already a lot of people attending these smaller churches, there's an audience that likes what's happening at the megachurch, and so the megachurch siphons off a lot of those people into this bigger environment. And that's part of the reason for the decline of the mom and pop churches in that area. So let's talk about the smaller churches, the ones that are down to an average of about 65 people right now. You mentioned in your reporting how they are under a lot of pressure. With only 65 people, everyone kind of has to show up and help out with giving, with taking care of the next generation and discipling them, with setting up the service, leading the music, doing the liturgy, being the ushers, giving the message. All of the work of the church falls upon pretty much everyone. And so that can lead to burnout and those kinds of problems. And if the pastor leaves, it can be hard to find someone who's willing to come in and serve that congregation. Often the pay is on the lower end of the scale. And so it's hard to find someone who can come in and give their life to that community. But you also share that these congregations often are the ones doing heroic work. They're resettling refugees. They are doing emergency relief after natural disasters. They're running a food pantry for their community. They're doing a tutoring program for disadvantaged kids. They're some of the best of what we would hope to see from a Christian church. So I wanted to know, what stories of hope do you have for these smaller congregations?
Well, there's all kinds of ones. I think I think one thing, it's easy to sort of blame the mega churches, and I think that's hard to. They're doing some things really well, and people have chosen to go there, right? People, the thing about American religion is it's basically do yourself. You do it yourself. You pick where you're going to go. You vote with your feet, and sometimes they've been really good at people have been really good at starting new churches, and so we have churches where people used to live, right? Sometimes, and no churches where they do live now. But one of the things, there are some really interesting small churches out there that are just plugging on. I was thinking of, I just moved to a small town in outside of Chicago called Woodstock, Illinois. And during COVID, the local food pantry had to shut down because they lost their building. They lost their lease, so they can no longer meet. So a group of small churches in town decided to partner with the local food bank to start a mobile food pantry. So every other week, in the parking lot of one of the churches, the big truck shows up, and a whole bunch of volunteers from all these little churches show up, and a couple hundred people show up in their cars to get groceries. And they were able to do this quickly and nimbly, and if that wasn't there, then there's all these families that would not have access to enough food to eat. There is this wonderful story in Smyrna, Tennessee about a little church called All Saints. It's probably my favorite story in the book, one of my favorite stories. But this little church, they were part of a split. They were in the Episcopal Church. There was a split. The pastor did not like the new presiding bishop. He leaves with all the congregation, and they were left with a building, and a handful of people, and a mortgage they couldn't afford to pay. So they're going to shut it down. Small new pastor comes in. He's young. His job is to basically sell the church, shepherd people through the closing, and as he's doing that, a group of people from Myanmar show up, Burmese refugees, and they say they're Anglicans. They've come to work at a meatpacking place. They need a place to worship, and he's like, "Well, we're going to close the church," and they're like, "Well, we still need to worship," and these refugees end up saving this little church, and now it's still going strong. In fact, there was a movie about it called All Saints, which is very good. Sometimes the faith-based movies aren't as good, and that's not sometimes they're good. This one is good. But it's this church that was saved by basically refugees showing up and needing help. There's this great little church in Stearns, Kentucky, which is McCreary County, one of the poorest communities in the country. They have built a tiny home community. They do all kinds of home repairs in the community. At Thanksgiving, they host a meal that feeds 1,500 people. I know really big churches that could not do that. These folks do it with some volunteers, but it's run with this pastor of the small church. There's probably 60 people. These folks are often faithful. They are connected to the community. I was just at the service for a small church that closed, and they had this food pantry that was remarkable. In fact, they closed. They're going to give their building to start new congregations. But there's all kinds of vibrancy there. The question is, how long can you keep that going? You wear people out. There are some new churches that are being revitalized where big churches and new churches partner. So sometimes where big churches gobble up little churches, take them over, and repurpose them as satellite campuses. There are other places where larger congregations lend people and money to a church that's struggling to kind of get them back up on their feet. So there's all kinds of great possibilities. This really interesting church in Sacramento called The Table. It's older, shrinking United Methodist Church, historic church. The new pastors come in. They kind of shepherd the old church, but they start this new thing called The Table, which is very intentionally Methodist. They do the method in Methodism, right? They have weekly classes. They talk very, very seriously and intentionally about spiritual development. Before you join the church, you go through a class where they talk about, here's how we do things. Tell us your spiritual journey. Is this a good match? They're really intentional about building community. They have a kind of newer and thriving church. They've got kind of nice music that's kind of jazz. They have a farm in the community. They're going to try and start a bakery. They're going to try a spiritual community around it was a community garden. So they've taken it over because the people running it had to leave. They're going to try and start a bakery and spiritual community around food there. So they're doing all these really interesting things. There's lots of possibilities. Sometimes it is because the church says, well, we're just going to do our thing and we're going to keep going. And sometimes they have enough money in the bank to keep going. But there are possibilities. There's possibilities too if they ask for help. This food pantry, for example, it's not run by one church. It's hosted by one church. A whole bunch of little churches jump in because they know they need each other. And if you go to a small town where churches are the kind of backbone of things, all those churches are working together, and they are not thinking about their theological divides. Because I have this friend who's a small Baptist pastor in a small town. He used to be the mayor of the smallest town in Tennessee. Now he moved to the small town was 50 people. Now he's in a town about 300, 400 people, right? He's in a big town. But he and the other pastors all get along, right? There's a woman pastor at the Methodist church, one pastor at the Pentecostal church. He's Southern Baptist. The denomination does not believe in women pastors. They work together all the time because they have to. And so there can be a kind of desperation that leads to inventiveness and cooperation that small churches have. And I think it helps people to know that they're normal. Now, the thing is, most people go to big churches. If you look at the kind of data, most people go to, if they go to church, they're at a church of 350 people or more. But most churches are small. And so there are some ways, I think you do see some people leaving large churches because you can't form community there. It's harder. Sometimes you get a small group. It's harder to, people tend to do less. They tend to volunteer less. They tend to be less involved in big churches. But I think there's all kinds of possibilities for small churches. And I think for them to say that we are, and if you have 200 people in your church, you're one of the top churches in America. You're in the top 15% of churches. And I don't think people think that either. They think, oh, wait. And I think this is the issue for denominations and the kind of broader church issue. There are all these arguments going on right now while all these churches are shrinking. And there are arguments over sexuality, there's arguments over politics, there's arguments over theology, all important, all crucial. I don't have the answers for any of them because I'm not a theologian. But as that's happening, the kind of infrastructure of churches is burning down around them. And if you don't pay attention to that, when the argument's over, there's going to be nothing left. So that's my pontification for today. That the kind of renewal of congregations and cooperation and focus on how do you build communities that are sustainable is the kind of burning question for churches. Because those churches are important for the lives of their people. They're important for their communities. They're important for their congregations. So they're important for individuals, right? They're important for the congregation. They're also for the people around the community. They often offer really important things for that community that won't be there. And if they're gone, once they're gone, they're gone. And if all you have left is large churches where people don't live, then you have no connection to the community, and people who need help can't get to those resources. Long answer, but...
No, and it's those stories, you tell a lot of those stories in Reorganized Religion, and it really moved my heart. Again, that story about the church that is thinking it needs to close, but it decides instead to open up its arms to the Burmese refugees, and that becomes the growth and the health of that church. What an inspiring story. I need to check out the movie. But, you mentioned earlier one of the big mega trends is this big sort where we're being taught to hate other people based on the views they hold. But then these stories are stories of hope because you have people who are choosing to love their neighbors, just whether they are needing food or some other kind of neighborly care. Churches are coming together across theology and other things that might divide us and choosing to say, we're going to love each other, we're going to love our neighbors, we're going to cooperate together. I mean, that is a model for our nation. And in their weakness and in their struggling, I think they're showing us something very beautiful.
And I think they have a kind of can-do or moxie. Maybe the moxie is the right word, where they don't know what they can't do, so they just do it. There's this little church in Spring Green, Wisconsin. It's a charismatic church started by a minister. Now the minister I would say, he's tri-vocational. He's an IT person, so he doesn't, he's the pastor. He's also the ambulance chief in the fire department, the volunteer fire department. So he's very involved, right? His wife is involved, works in the community as well. So they have this, so they have full-time jobs. They also have this church they're part of. But they've had community meals. They've done COVID things. They are sponsoring a refugee family. There's probably, when I went there was about less than 20 people to visit this church. they just do their thing, and they have this moxie to keep going because now they don't have every single program. They didn't have a kids ministry. They didn't have all these things, but they do have a kind of sense that what they do is important and what they do matters, and that they are not. It's a place in a large church you can't do things because they have either the church has more bureaucracy or it has a very limited mission. There's this idea of what they call simple church, which was basically stripped down. We only do these 3 or 4 things. That's all we do. Anyone else wants to do anything, you got to do it somewhere. You can't do it, and it can limit people. It can limit the ideas that people can do. It can limit the impact of the church, but it also sends this message that, like, if you want to do something, we can only do these giant things, and we can't do like the kind of on the ground. Let's do the small thing. And also, they're like, well, we can't do that thing; it's too much work. And the little church is like, well, everything is too much work. We're just going to do it all. Now it's hard, and the people are tired, and that's the point. Is sustainable long term? But there can be a moxie to a church that says we're just doing our thing, and we're just going to keep doing it. And sometimes when they do it long enough, some new things will happen.
It's a complex story. So let's turn to the mega churches. I have always been a part of one of the larger churches in America, from my childhood to the church I went to in college. Mm-hmm. The churches I've been to my entire life have always been the larger churches. Now, I was part of a church plant that was on the small side. We were under 100 for the time I was there. And I was part of almost a house church in a low-resource neighborhood in Boston. That was maybe, 12 of us on a good day. And if we were lucky, there were 12 kids, too. And that doubled our numbers. And so I've had some, relational time with the small churches. But my preference has generally been to join a large church. And like you say, the research shows that statistically, if you're going to church, you're probably going to a larger church. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to criticize the mega churches. I do it. I'm very invested in my current church, which is a larger church for our area. But some of the things that you identify in your book, or that I'm wanting to say at least, are that these churches, though they look large and prosperous and stable, big buildings, big budgets, big numbers of people coming, is there's actually a kind of fragility in these systems, because one leadership scandal, and that can be devastating to it. It can be hard to find just a replacement pastor, even in the best of times, to transition from one successful pastor to another one. Often the power is very top-down and concentrated, and that can limit the flexibility of the church, as you just mentioned. And there's a free riding problem, because people see the services and the benefits they come to get, but they don't necessarily come to serve and contribute. And there can be a way of effective marketing and branding of the community, and so people come as consumers to that religious content, but again, they may not be being formed to love and to serve and to contribute to the mission of that church. So there's all the problems are out there about mega churches. I wanted to ask you again the stories of hope for mega churches. Any larger churches that you see are doing things to become more resilient and have sustainability over the long term?
Yeah, I was just talking to a pastor at one of the larger churches in the community, and it was very interesting. I think COVID opened their eyes a great deal. They've had other challenges, but COVID was a real eye-opener for them, because there's been so much focus, and if you look at larger congregations, it's often focused on what they call the Sunday experience. Sometimes they don't even call a service, they call it a worship experience. That was a thing for a while, which is, you have a great speaker, you have great music, you have great coffee, you have great environment. And it can turn churches into kind of content producers. So you podcast, you video it, you stream it, this is great. Well, then COVID comes, and people can't come to church. But they can sure get the content, right? Without any, and a lot of these churches are built on what they call worship one, serve one. You come to one service, you help volunteer at the other. Now you can get all that content without serving, without, why do I come to church? So there's kind of a change of like, wait, if we're just content providers and experience providers, and people don't do that anymore. What do we do? How do we gather people? How do we make this say this is important to people? I think there's a lot of that. I don't think any big church wants to be that next church that has a scandal, right? They don't want their pastor to implode. They don't want that. They don't see themselves as, they see themselves as trying to do good and trying to do the right thing, trying to reach lots of people. They are not, I mean, I'm sure there are bad actors everywhere, but that's not their self-identity. I think there is kind of a realization that, oh, wait, maybe this isn't the best model. It's not quite there yet, but I do think that congregations are starting to say they don't want to be the one that implodes. How do we safeguard people? And it's hard to do, because how do you build a healthy, sustainable model when the charismatic pastor who draws a lot of people works after a fashion? And it works better than non-charismatic pastor, right, for those big churches. So how do they do that, and how do they grow? And I think that's a challenge for people. Like, how do I build something, and how do I offer people something that's not just what they want to hear? Because you can build right now, there are churches that have been built right now on kind of anti-COVID messages, or kind of Christian nationalism, or politics, right? There's a kind of way of building that to find people that kind of draws on the, well, if people want to know who to hate, we can do that too. Which is, I don't think it's a long-term, it has, how should I say this? It can be at odds with their teaching, right? So this is actually the real problem for any congregation right now. I would think for larger ones, especially because you want to draw people in. You might avoid talking about complicated issues because you don't have conflict, because you know you're going to have conflict. So one of the biggest churches in the country is, and a very influential church, is McLean Bible Church, very influential church out in Virginia. They had a revolt against their pastor because he started who was very popular because he started talking about race and justice, which are in the Bible. So this is there's going to be this conflict for those churches, because you want to draw people in, and you need to become more diverse. As you become more diverse, people are going to have different points of view, and they're going to want to talk about them. But talking about them can lead to conflict. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to because you don't have the connective tissue of relationship to get people to It's difficult to talk about very complex issues with people you don't trust or you don't know. And a smaller congregation, you can have people you can trust to know. How do you build that in a large church? I think there's a lot of congregations that are thinking about that. I don't know if all of them are. So everyone's trying to survive as well. But I think that big church model. So Mark Chaves calls the mega church model, a sign of decline in American religion because of the free riding problem. Because people participate less, give less, they stay, and they may not stay as long. So what do you do if you don't? If you've built a weak, very large institution, and if they crumble, if the pastor of a small church of 100 people, or a big, a church of 100 people implodes, then 100 people are affected. If a pastor of 5,000, that's 50 of those little churches. So the effect, and it's on the evening news. So they have real complicated problems. And they are built for this kind of large-scale, grow a lot of people, draw a lot of people world, which may no longer exist. And so what do they do now that they have these big institutions? How do they put those to work? How do they use their platform? How do they use that relationship to build deeper? I mean, Willow Creek, before Bill Hybels had his implosion, their other big issue a few years before that was their kind of studies and saying that people aren't growing spiritually. They had this whole thing like, oh wait, we didn't grow people spiritually. Then they kind of had a focus a new program to redo that. But there is a problem there. How do you build sustainable long-term faith in people that turns into sustainable long-term communities?
Yeah, to try and summarize what I'm gleaning from your observations of so many different larger churches all across the country is we need to take time to really listen and understand how things have changed, and then be responsive to that reality. How do we build in a safeguarding culture at our church? How do we build in better systems of accountability even for a charismatic pastor? How do we create more transparency within the church operations? How do we connect people not just to a worship concert on a Sunday, but how do we connect them into high trust relationships where we can process the difficult questions of today's world? And so a lot of it sounds to me like we have to just take our heads out of the sand, see how different the environment is, and then, slowly shift the culture of these larger churches to be more resilient and adaptable and flexible to engage our neighbors with love and care and prepare for this changing environment.
Yeah. I would think, the one image I've been thinking about is the image of a drone. We've seen lots of more drone pictures now, where we get a different view of the world than we did before. And I don't know if they've got their head in the sand that they just don't see because they're in the wrong spot. If you look at your house or your town or your community or a forest from a drone, you get a whole different view. I don't know if you've ever seen Men in Black.
Oh,
One
yeah.
of the Men in Black movies where there's a crystal that has like the whole universe in it. And then you pull back and there's another universe. And then there's like perspective really matters here. And I think sometimes congregations get so insular they don't see they might see some of the trends, but they don't always see that bigger picture. And so I think some of this is to say, let's take a step back or 2 or 10 and say, and people sometimes talk about the 5,000 or 10,000 foot view. I think one things that drones have shown us is like, and I'm just making this up, but I'm just thinking about it, it's that 100-foot view is kind of nice. You can kind of see. Not 10,000 foot, but like 100 or 200 feet, you can see what's around you, but you're not just completely disconnected to it. Because and if you're looking down from an airplane, you have no connection to what really is going on there. You can see large scale trends, but you don't see how those trends are playing out in your community. But if you're 102 feet, 100 feet up in a drone, you go, oh, look at what's around us. That's kind of different.
So Reorganized Religion is kind of the drone photography of religion reporting right now.
I would say that's a good, I might use that again.
Okay. No, I think that's a really helpful metaphor. So let's do a drone-eyed view of an issue that is tearing our country apart. Right now, I think the statistics I've seen from the polling is if you're a Republican, you loathe Democrats. Can't stand them. And vice versa. If you're a Democrat, Republicans are the enemy of America. And there's just, in the language in which we're describing one another is getting harsher and meaner and more dehumanizing in terms of how we describe our fellow neighbors because of their political affiliation. And of course, independents aren't loyal to either team, and so they're a problem too, right? Everyone's got an angle from which they're on the high ground and other people are despicable. And a part of the demographic changes is we've gone from a largely white and largely Christian country to a pluralistic environment and a very diverse environment ethnically and culturally. But we're polarized. We're polarized on COVID. We're polarized on politics. And part of what you're saying is that if a church chooses to buy into this polarization, that can really work for them. Because now there's consistency. We're all alike. We all believe the same things. We all know who the enemy is. And that's galvanizing to be on this war footing as a church. And that can be placed into spiritual language. There's the work of Satan, and then, there's what we're doing as God's ambassadors. So what are some of the ways you're seeing this trend play out in the American church?
Oh, we see this all over the place. You see it in the kind of... We saw it at David Platt's church, where they had... David Platt was at McLean Bible Church. He's known for this book, Radical, which is basically give up the American dream and go serve God, and was very big on missions, very popular among Southern Baptists. All of a sudden, he's seen as liberal and woke because he talked about race. You've seen this kind of fracturing where people who, even a few years ago, you had this move where, even among the kind of white evangelical folks, right, megachurch folks, this idea, they were realizing that the country's changing, we have more diversity. As we get more diversity, we're realizing that things aren't always as great as they used to be. And so how do you look back in your past, evaluate that, and build something new when different people are at the table, right? So if the table used to be, mostly white folks and a few people of color, that's a different table than if everyone is at the table and they're all different and there's no majority or no mega majority. So I think you see places where people, all of a sudden, they're hearing about things that make them feel uncomfortable, and it's kind of working at cross purposes. So if the values of the church and the values of the faith conflict with the kind of group dynamics, that's a real problem. But you see this, so that's why the Southern Baptists right now are kind of riven with this, what they call the woke war, which is there's kind of a idea that if you talk about diversity or justice or these other issues, you have somehow become woke and you're dividing people. You see this among United Methodists, where people with different ideas about sexuality are at each other. I think that one of the questions you really have so I think there's kind of two things hitting each other. One is this need to become more. There's ideas in the Bible about being more diverse and kind of a cross-cutting identity, right? That the faith unites all kinds of different people. There is this idea that you're going to need that to have sustainable communities in the future. And yet, the way we've organized is that we don't have many what they call cross-cutting identities. You don't have people who are different that are organized in the same place. So they're going to be at odds with each other. And if you say to people, so one of the people in the book had this great line. It's like, it's hard to go to church with people who think you're the devil. So if the pastor is saying, these are the people of the enemy, and you go, wait, that's me, you're not going to want to stay there. And people will know if you don't like them or hate them. So one of the arguments I make in the book is about the positive impact that churches have in social safety net in people's lives. And the importance of them, right? The stabilizing effect. They have a destabilizing negative effect. And you can use all the same power of organized religion to harm other people and advance your group. So that's going to be the question, like in that very diverse world, what will people choose? Will they choose to say, we want to make sure we all thrive, or do you want to say my group thrives? And the people might say that I want my group thrive so that we all thrive. And there's sometimes you want your group to grow, but there is kind of a clash of ideas. So if you say that you're there to bless the community, that you should love your enemies, and you have a political, social power structure that says, no, we want to break our enemies because they're the enemy. How do you make those two work together? Because the things that would make, and you can grow your church a bit on that, but you're growing as a fractured, smaller group that doesn't have long-term staying power. Short-term growth, but not a long-term, because that group is not going to stay around forever.
Those are major tensions. And, Bob, I've had to sort through that myself. You said people know if you don't like them, and I have to confess, I've fallen off of that too many times. It's embarrassing to think about how I've fallen into that trap. And I have to keep reminding myself, like, I've been vocal in saying why I don't support Donald Trump as a political leader in our country. But I had to ask myself the question, does that mean I'm not going to like people who voted for Trump and support Trump? Am I not going to be friends with them? Mm-hmm. And I had to say, that's silly. I mean, that's actually ridiculous. Like, if someone votes for Trump and even is a big Trumper, I can still choose to like them and love them. There are other parts of their identity that I can connect with and enjoy. And we can have that be a disagreement without it being a relationship ender. Now, they may not feel that way about me, but my posture towards them is hopefully one of acceptance. And I had to ask myself the same question because I'm not aligned with the Democratic Party on a number of issues. And I had to ask myself, if someone embraces the Democratic Party platform, is that a disagreement or does that end the relationship? And I, again, want to choose to say, I like this person, I love this person, I accept this person. We can have a political disagreement, but that doesn't mean they're my enemy. And it's difficult to sustain that posture. And I'm not saying I'm an exemplar of it, but it takes a lot of intentionality to resist this pressure to see people as our enemies. And it's helpful to hear how, it's not just me. I saw someone post the other day, the imposter fallacy is that you and you alone are the only one who doesn't have what it takes. And of course, we're all struggling with that in different ways.
Yeah.
And so,
these are the issues that churches will have to resolve, because the goals of political advancement and the goals of the church are often at odds. And how do you resolve that? And how do you have a place? And sometimes it's resolved by they don't talk about anything, right? Which excuse me, can turn out that then you drive people away. But it's complicated, and I think what churches are really good at, and have had for a long time, in other religious groups as well, they're really good at adapting to new cultural environments, finding community across cultural divides, finding ways to connect with people of different viewpoints. And so one of the things that made the United States really interesting is when the founders came, they don't have an established religion because they don't want the religious wars that were in other parts of the world to come there. And I think there's something kind of a genius in that, to say that you can have this free exercise religion but without established religion, so that there's room for everyone, and that one of the rules of religion is to unite and to be a backbone. But these are the choices, right? I talking early in the book about, and maybe we could kind of come to an end on this. For me, like early in the book, I talk about a day early in my career I end the book with this actually. 2008, I just come to Tennessee to cover religion for the Nashville Tennessean, and I cover a tornado, an election, and a mosque burning within a couple days. So it's election night, Super Tuesday. We cover the election. Then there's a tornado, wipes out the small town. And so that Saturday, I come to the small town, all these religious groups doing their thing. And if you've never been to a disaster site, you will not realize you haven't realized how religious it is. You have the Baptists and the Methodists and the atheists and the Jewish folks and all kinds of other different folks. They're doing their things. And they all have different parts, and the Presbyterians and Lutherans and the Mennonites. They're all cooking meals, and they're clearing off trees, and they'll clean out people's houses. So I cover all that, write this all up. Then on the way home, I get a call, oh, you have to go to Columbia, Tennessee. It's about an hour south of Nashville. Somebody burned down the mosque there. So I show there, the mosque is still smoldering. Someone's got white power. We run the world on it. And to me that day, it struck with me about which group do you want to be? Do you want the people who see your neighbors and run to their aid? Do you want the people that say, no, get out of here? And that's the choice that religious groups right now have to change in this really complex environment, is which people do you want to be? And it's not clear what they're going to choose.
Wow. Well, Bob Smietana, everyone, his book is Reorganized Religion. I've read it cover to cover, found it very interesting. And Bob, your book has really helped me understand. And that, I think, is one of the first steps of love and care for our neighbors. So, Bob, thank you for sharing your heart with us and these stories with us and these insights, because you're helping us understand our country and all of its complexity and diversity. It's a real gift, and I'm grateful you wrote the book, and I'm really grateful you've come on to share with us today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. And if you've made it this far, I want to say that processing all of this takes time, and it takes community. And so I want to invite you to go to uncommonpursuit.net and create a free account and join the conversation about this book. There are a lot of threads that we've covered today, and it takes time to go from just being a passive recipient of this information and become an active participant in your own transformation. And so what I believe is that by reading Bob's book and preparing for this interview and having this conversation, it's changed me. It's helped me understand the world in a better place. And I want you to have that same experience. And that means going from just I watched it or I read the book to I've talked about it with others. And that's what the Uncommon Pursuit community is going to offer you. So thanks for joining us today. We hope we'll see you at a future event, and we hope you have a great day.